straight in. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. Really lovely to see you. I'm going to share my screen because I've got some slides here. And obviously the topic today is, sorry, that's good. I'm stealing my own thunder there. So yeah, obviously the topic we're trying to tackle today is a complex one and one with many opinions and angles. So I'm very pleased that we're joined by some real experts in the field to help us explore it and dive into it in more detail. Those experts are Tajal Patel from CTW, who are a signatory. Then we've got Kavya Vago from Just Capital, who are a good friend of the WDI. And finally, we've got Julie Pascoe, who is going to give us a more of a European angle. Just so we're all on the same page and we all know what the session is about, the kind of two main aims. One, we want to dive into the difficulties around collecting the data, but why corporate transparency is really important on these issues. And then the second bit is to explore what different stakeholders are doing in this area to improve racial equality. So hopefully that sounds interesting and exciting for everyone. Quick run through of the agenda. I'm going to give a quick intro about the WDI perspective on these issues. Dajal will talk about CTW's work on racial audits. And then Kavya will talk about in more detail about what data US companies are collecting. And Julie, as we mentioned, is going to give us more of the European angle about what European companies are doing to tackle all these issues. Then we'll have a 15-minute panel discussion, and then we should have time for a Q&A at the end. But please send your questions whenever they occur to you through the function in Zoom, and my lovely colleagues Bethany and Anya will be handling them for us. So if they see that a question is particularly pertinent to the topic we're talking about at that moment, they'll stop and we'll ask the question then, but otherwise we'll just save them to the end. So hopefully that sounds like a good lineup for everyone. So talking about the WDI perspective then, and to give you a bit of background about our approach to these issues. So we have 4 questions explicitly on ethnicity, but obviously it does come into play in lots of different parts of the survey. It won't surprise anyone that the majority of the questions are in the D&I section 4, where we ask for the ethnicity makeup of the workforce as a whole and of leadership. And then we ask for the internal HER rate by ethnicity. And then we have one other one in section 5, which looks or asks for the ethnicity pay gap along with the gender pay gap and the CEO median worker pay ratio, things like that. And it is worth just bearing in mind with all these questions that we do have a caveat for the companies taking part that allows them, if they can't collect this data, they're legally prohibited from collecting this data in all the operations they operate in, then they can explain that, and that's fine. So there is provision for that as well. But what we're really trying to demonstrate with this session is the value of persevering and collecting what you can, where you can, as fully as you can, to make sure that everyone's accounted for, that they're provided for adequately and cared for ultimately by their employers. So because we have found in the data that companies submit to the WDI that there isn't much information out there, and companies aren't comfortable disclosing a lot of information around these issues. One of the key findings we found last year in the 2020 data was that diversity data collection isn't universal for different groups of people, and I'm sure that won't surprise people. And generally, companies had lots more gender data than ethnicity data. It came out most starkly in 3 main ways. So the main one there is on the screen for you, that more than twice as many companies could provide data on the gender breakdown of their workforce, but only about a third could provide the ethnicity composition. So a big gap there. Two other things though came out of it as well, that 94% of respondents could give figures for leadership by gender. So pretty much the whole group could give gender data for the leadership positions, but again, only 31% could for ethnicity. And then finally, 52 companies of 141 total responders, only 52 provided some ethnicity data at all, whereas almost all of the companies had some gender information. So there is quite a big contrast there in where companies have data, or at least where they're comfortable reporting data for different groups of individuals. And then just a tiny bit more information about that from the data we got from companies last year, that obviously the more specific we got with asking about ethnicity data, the less information was available. So that companies were able to provide, the number of companies who are able to provide wage levels were over 10 times more for the gender pay gap than for the ethnicity pay gap. So really quite stark. And of the 8 companies that did provide an ethnicity pay gap, so that's the 4% is 8 companies in total, 5 of those were from the US, where of course that kind of information is much more regulated, and Tejal and Kevia are going to talk a bit about that in a second. And finally, 78% of companies reported on action to address pay gaps, which is fantastic. Lots of companies having information about how they do want to tackle these pay gaps, but actually only 18 in total made specific reference to ethnicity. So just to set the scene slightly for you for what we're seeing from the data that's submitted to the WDI. If you do want a bit more information generally about diversity and inclusion, not specifically ethnicity, but diversity and inclusion generally, our FAB research manager, Charlotte Lush, has produced a D&I briefing, which is available on the website, and I'll put the link to the public version in the chat as well for everyone who wants to go and have a look at it. But it does give a lot of insight and analysis into what we're seeing and what we think companies and investors should be doing in this area. And lovely, that's my introduction. I'm going to hand over to Tejal now to talk about racial equity audits. So thank you very, very much, Tejal. Let me stop sharing.
Thanks, Rosie. Okay. All right. I think I got it. Everybody can see my screen, I hope.
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. So thanks very much, Rosie. Thank you, WDI, for inviting me to present a little bit on the racial equity audit proposal that we filed at major banks. I think, as we get started on talking about this, I want to put the proposal into a little bit of context. And to do that, we need to think a little bit about what the costs of racial inequality are, both in terms of the US economy, but also in terms of kind of the shareholder's perspective. So Citi, which is one of the recipients of the proposal, recently came out with a report that found that the failure to address racial inequality cost the US economy about $16 trillion over the last 20 years. That includes about 13 trillion in business revenues that were lost. And there's a couple of other statistics here on this slide that really demonstrate that there's a very clear business case, I think, that many of these corporations even recognized in making their statements in the wake of the racial justice protests that happened in the United States last June. Companies can't keep treating the issue of racial inequality as sort of the cost of doing business. And there's likely to be reputational harm, really, if they continue to do so. And from an investor standpoint, we really need better transparency as to what's being done to identify and remedy these issues. And that's really where the audit comes in. So given this context and kind of following the events of last June, the finance industry committed between $25 million to $30 billion in funding to combat systemic racism. And we, along with the SEIU Capital Stewardship team, launched a racial equity audit initiative at several major banks that we believe to be systemically important to the US economy, but also in building economic wealth among communities of color. So the proposals went to vote at the companies that are listed here. All of the proposals request the same thing, that the board oversee a racial equity audit analyzing the bank's adverse impacts on non-white stakeholders and communities of color. We've asked that the companies kind of determine the topics based on engagement with stakeholders like community groups and employees. And it's really intended to be an internal and external review. So it would look at things like human capital management, but it's also going to look at the impact that financial products may have had on communities of color, that some of their philanthropic or political donations might have had on communities of color. What we're really trying to do is weigh the statements that they've made and these significant financial commitments, again, against their actions. And I do also want to note that actually very similar proposals were filed in other industries as well. There was one at J&J by Trillium Asset Management, and there's another one that's been filed at Amazon by the New York State Comptroller's Office, which is actually going to vote in a couple of hours. So, and speaking of votes, I don't want to hide the ball. All of the equity audit proposals have actually been voted on, with the exception of the proposal at Amazon. The proposals have done incredibly well, I think, particularly in light of the fact that it's a brand new kind of social proposal. To give folks a little bit of context, usually new proposals get in the single digits the first year. And just generally last year's social proposals averaged around 28%. So to get in the upper 30s and almost 40% actually at JP Morgan indicates to us that shareholders are really expecting an independent and verifiable assessment that these commitments and programs related to racial equality are actually working. So what exactly is the racial equity audit? What is it that we were asking for? We believe that there's four main components. I'm going to really be focusing on the benchmarking element because that's really about kind of developing metrics in the employment context, and data collection. But I will go through kind of all four of the elements. So the first one is, there we go. So the first one is the independent and objective review, right? So audits generally, they encourage public trust and reliance on the accuracy of the information that's being presented. And the independent review process is a really central pillar, I would say, to this proposal, because we want to ensure that the information being provided by the companies is verifiable, that it's credible. And, you know, to be very clear, what we're asking for is not just disclosure on what steps the bank is already taking and what their plans are, because to be very honest with you, many of these banks have disclosed quite a bit on what their plans are to address racial equality or inequality, excuse me. What we're really asking for is an independent review of the actions and policies taken by the bank as part of their commitments to racial justice. We're actually asking about how effective these plans have been, right? And it's really important to remember that the review has to be conducted by people who have civil rights and economic justice expertise. It can't necessarily be conducted by management or the board because they just don't have that type of background typically. Many of these banks have also consulted with outside stakeholder groups that have sort of partnered with the banks. And those groups do have, very strong expertise in civil rights related issues oftentimes, but they may not have the resources available for a review of this scale, really. So the second element is benchmarking, and this is where I'm going to try to spend the bulk of my time. This is really an evaluation of what's working and what isn't. So there are existing regulatory requirements here in the US, like the bank's Community Reinvestment Act reporting requirements or the EEO-1 disclosure that we can kind of use as a start for a racial equity audit. But the idea of the equity audit is to really dig underneath the surface reporting to examine internal corporate models. And many of the regulatory requirements, to be honest with you, have sort of issues themselves. The CRA, for example, has some really fundamental flaws when you're looking at it from a racial equity standpoint. It does not focus on the full scope of the bank's operations. It's really focused on the equitability of the bank's lending, investment, and services. It doesn't look at philanthropic donations, political donations. It doesn't look at HR-related issues or discrimination claims and things like that. It's very focused on the lending. The other thing is that the CRA is actually technically not looking at racial equity. It's intended to evaluate, to make sure really that the services of the bank are available to all communities, including low and moderate income communities. So it's really an income-based test, not race-based. And obviously, while there may be overlap, they're not the same thing. The other regulatory obligation that is often noted, I think, in our discussion with the banks is a disclosure known as the EEO-1 report. So this is focused more kind of in the employment context. It's basically aggregate data that breaks down the company's workforce by race, ethnicity, and gender. It's compiled into a report, and it's required to be submitted by these companies to a federal agency. The banks are not required to disclose the submission publicly, though many of them have started voluntarily doing it at the urging of shareholders, led largely by the New York City Comptroller's Office. And so while we do have some disclosure in kind of the workforce breakdown, let's say it's the percentage of Black or Hispanic employees that are in management positions, that's sort of where the story ends. We have no idea really what's being done to retain employees of color, why attrition's occurring. And that, I think, is an area where the racial equity audit can really help and kind of build on this information. So what is an auditor going to look at from, let's say, a human capital management perspective? So this is in the employment context. We would want them to basically conduct a DE&I evaluation, diversity, equity, inclusion evaluation, using qualitative and quantitative data sourced from complaints, meetings and focus groups, survey responses. We would want to make sure that these inquiries are being conducted in consultation with multiple levels of employees. So you're looking at line level folks, you're looking at kind of middle management as well. We also want to look at the key practices of the bank. So what's the company's culture and climate? How accessible and accountable is the company when issues are raised? How does the company address attrition attributed to people of color? Because that's something that we often see from the EEO-1 report. And what criteria is being used to promote and retain people of color and kind of move them into upper management? There's obviously the issue of pay discrepancies, which Rosie sort of alluded to earlier. Is that already, are the pay discrepancies already being disclosed and addressed? Is there a policy that allows workers to disclose and discuss their pay with each other without retaliation? And then the last thing is looking at senior executive compensation metrics. So are there ties to senior executives kind of meeting DE&I goals, and how much is the weighting for that factor in terms of the overall award? Those are just a couple of the elements, I think, kind of in the employment context when it comes to kind of workforce related disclosures that we think that the audit could really help with. I think that's the next slide, yeah. So the other element to this, the third element, is really board oversight. We're asking for board oversight so that the directors are fully informed of the effectiveness of their programs. These companies have made significant financial commitments that require oversight from the top. JP Morgan, for example, has committed $30 billion over the course of 4 years. And we have to keep in mind that boards have a fiduciary obligation to act in the best interest of their stakeholders, of their shareholders. And an audit like this is really a risk mitigation mechanism, right? There's going to be increasing pressure from a variety of groups really that demand that the company really gets it and that they're proactively taking measures to address racial inequality. And we are asking and hoping that the directors would actually engage with stakeholders as appropriate, and that includes their employees if it's in the right setting, to really understand what some of the issues are that the companies are facing. And then the last element is disclosure on effectiveness. So this audit would allow for greater transparency. And again, I want to reiterate that the focus on the disclosure element isn't disclosure of what steps the bank's already taking. This element is really related to the disclosure of how effective these steps are and what could be improved. And the quality of the information provided is very important. It doesn't need to be granular. We recognize that companies have, significant litigation risks, But these disclosures can be drafted in such a way that it holds the company accountable to its shareholders. And we've seen it done in things like these sexual harassment reporting reports that come out, board level reports, and other kind of risk reports that come out at the board level. When we evaluate this disclosure, we really want it to explain how a particular issue was looked at, what issues were identified, and what's the roadmap to remedy or improve a particular problem. And the last thing that I've got here is just, we have a couple of examples actually of similar audits that have been undertaken by companies like Facebook, Starbucks, and Airbnb. All of these companies conducted a third-party audit. They were done in consultation with stakeholders, and eventually the findings were made public. And I think that it's just really important when we look at this particular proposal to remember that demands to eliminate systemic racism aren't going to disappear. And if anything, the demographics in America are really changing in coming decades, and racial justice is going to become increasingly important to younger investors. So in that context, doing a deep dive into unconscious, or subtle forms of discrimination can really be viewed as a smart investment, really, that's going to contribute to long-term shareholder value. And if anybody has any questions, I don't know if our slides are up, but our website does have a tab on the racial equity audit, and there's more information available there. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Tejal. Yeah, Kavya, if we could hand straight over to you, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, hello, everyone. My name is Kavya Vagel, and I'm the Senior Director of Research here at Just Capital. For those of you who may be less familiar with what we do, Just Capital is a nonprofit organization that focuses on measuring how America's largest publicly traded companies fare when it comes to stakeholder capitalism. Our work specifically digs into understanding how corporations are best serving their workers, customers, communities, the environment, and shareholders. So it was only natural for us to begin digging into what they were doing to address racial inequities too. The legacy of racism in the United States and in the justice system is no means new, but large-scale corporate response to it was galvanized back in 2020, just a year ago yesterday. Following the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many other Black and Brown Americans, America's largest corporations began to speak out about racial inequities. When we started looking at this back in June 2020, we found that out of the 300 largest US employers we analyzed, 199, or about 66%, had made a statement in support of their Black colleagues and Black Lives Matter movements. Along with these statements came a refreshed perspective on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the tangible steps that companies could take to begin addressing racial equity for all of their different stakeholders. And sure enough, the American public expected the same of corporations. We found that a vast majority of Black American survey respondents believe that there's more work for companies to do to address racial inequities in the workplace, similar to what we saw writ large as well. And when taking a specific look on what companies could do to address worker and community issues, we found that a vast majority of Black respondents, as well as the public writ large, believe that there are a number of steps and concrete actions that they might be able to take. In response, we started seeing a small but growing corporate response over time. Here is an example, like Tejal was talking about EEO1 reports. When we started tracking this back in 2019, we found that just 3% of the entire Russell 1000 index released EEO1 disclosures. That's growing to about 6%, and actually today, about 85 companies have disclosed this information. But when we begin to dig under the hood, we realize that companies have a long ways to go in actually achieving diverse representation. And that's just one of the several elements that they can focus on to start thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in a more comprehensive way. That was the impetus for building our corporate racial equity tracker. We wanted to build a tool that allowed the public, consumers, and investors alike to explore what companies were actually doing to live up to their racial equity commitments. So in April of this past year, we launched our corporate racial equity tracker, which focused on America's 100 largest US employers to help evaluate what companies are doing to address longstanding racial inequities for their workers and their communities specifically. The tracker uses public disclosure data. So this means data that's found on company websites, corporate social responsibility reports, diversity and inclusion reports, and a number of other company-specific sources. We focus on multiple dimensions of company commitments and actions, and actually specifically 6 different dimensions of it. The tracker features information about anti-discrimination policies, pay equity, racial and ethnic diversity data, education and training programs, response to mass incarceration, and community investments. And underlying each of these 6 different dimensions are 22 data points, ranging from whether a company releases publicly their equal employment opportunity statement, or whether they have apprenticeship programs or career development programs. The tracker has helped us illuminate some top-line findings. Overall, we find that companies are near 100% likely in the tracker to disclose at least one policy related to anti-discrimination, education and training programs, and community investments, but are much less likely to disclose on pay equity issues, racial and ethnic diversity data, and responses to mass incarceration. These broad themes kind of distill into 4 key points. The first is that large companies, which we're measuring by US employment size, are highly likely to disclose general commitments. These commitments are essentially a statement or generic policy that notes that a company is committed to a certain element of anti-discrimination or inclusion. But at the same time, these large companies are far less likely to report out on concrete actions. These are programs, disclosures, or policies that show progress or accountability towards a commitment, or one that has an immediate impact. When taking a look at the tracker overall, just 18 companies out of the 100 largest have at least one policy in each of the 6 dimensions, and not a single company has implemented all 22 commitments or actions, suggesting that companies have a long ways to go when it comes to addressing racial inequity issues across multiple dimensions. We see this at the highest level of the tracker. This is a tree map that features all 22 data points in the tracker. C's stand for commitments, A's stand for actions. This chart helps us see that the blocks that are labeled C for commitment tend to be larger in size, indicating that companies have more disclosure in these areas, while those blocks labeled A tend to be much smaller, indicating lower levels of disclosure. This becomes extremely stark when we take a look at the example of anti-discrimination policies. Here we see that nearly 100%, almost 100%, just a couple percentage points away, have an EEO policy or anti-harassment policies or discrimination or harassment grievance mechanisms, which are all commitments that a company can make. But when it comes to the concrete action items that they can take to start changing culture in some way around anti-harassment training or quantitative diversity targets, far fewer companies have these types of actions. The tracker also allows us to dig deeper into the data and explore trends within specific dimension areas. I'll dig into an example of pay equity because I think it relates most to some of the diversity data that we've been talking about today. Just for context, for our non-US viewers, racial pay gaps in the US are generally defined as the difference in median earning between non-white and white workers. According to research by the Economic Policy Institute in 2019, Black workers' wages were at the median were about 76% of those of white workers, which amounts to a gap of $10,000 a year. When looking at the intersection between race and gender, it becomes clear that women of color tend to see the largest gaps in comparison to white men. For instance, Black women were paid 63% of white men's median earnings. The concerning trends of pay inequities in the United States at large are in somewhat of a contradiction to what we actually find in the tracker. Overall, we find that there's low disclosure on this particular action, which ends up masking the true state of racial pay equity among the largest corporations in the United States. Even among the 100 largest employers, which are most likely to disclose information on commitments and actions generally, less than a third of these companies are disclosing on conducting pay equity analyses, despite it being a concrete action step that companies can take to identify and fix wage gaps. Even fewer companies report results, and these results tend to be highly non-standardized. And when we take a look at the distribution of wage gaps or the pay ratios, it reveals that companies tend to report results only when their adjusted ratios, that means holding constant for all similarities between workers, are near 100%, which makes it incomparable to the median earnings ratios that we typically see in the US, and fundamentally stands at odds with what we know about the stark nature of pay equity. We can see this tangibly in these graphs. Again, 31% of companies disclose that they conduct a racial pay equity analysis. And we see that 15% of companies disclose results as ratios, but 7% disclose that there's no statistically significant difference while not reporting the ratio. When we take a look at the distribution, again, we see that all of the ratios cluster around this 1-to-1 ratio mark, suggesting again that companies are more likely to disclose ratios and the information about the results of their pay equity analyses only when they've reached near parity. The tracker also allows you to investigate some company examples. Some examples that I'd love to pull out are around Microsoft, who reports an adjusted pay ratio that's disaggregated by different race and ethnic groups, providing us a lot of detail and insight about how select ethnic groups fare. There's Starbucks, that truly stands out for excellent framework practices that they share and make public and available to many different companies, but then also reporting their raw median or unadjusted ratio, as well as their adjusted racial pay gap, for both of which they've achieved 100% pay parity in 2019. Intel is a unique example because they don't necessarily report pay ratios, but they do release something called the EEO1 Component 2, which is like the EEO1 report, a specific report that was meant to go to the EEOC that features pay band data by race and gender and 10 standardized job categories that really provides a comprehensive glimpse at the distribution of workers in different pay groups. So what exactly comes next? While the data has a lot of tracker, the commitments and actions highlighted in the tracker are just a starting point. We also believe that disclosure and transparency, even when the state of equity and racial equity information isn't perfect, is actually a critical accountability tool that companies can use to track progress and that the public and stakeholders can use to keep companies accountable towards that progress. Commitments and actions are also fundamentally not a substitute for the deeply interpersonal work that goes on into creating inclusive environments and cultivating a sense of belonging among Black and Brown colleagues. And remembering that racial equity issues are cross-cutting because of how entrenched racism and oppression are in our systems means that companies need to think proactively beyond workers and communities alone and consider how these racial inequity issues and their actions can affect customers, the environment, and shareholders as well. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to WDI for providing us the opportunity to share a bit about our racial equity tracker.
Lovely, thank you, Kavya, that's fantastic. Julie, if we could hand over to you now, that would be lovely. Thank you very, very much.
Hello, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me to present a bit of different approach on this issue, especially because we are working in Europe first, but also because we are a civil society organization that is actually advocating for better racial diversity practices in companies and also in public institutions, and more specifically working specifically on equality data collection disaggregated by race. So the European Network Against Racism is the only pan-European network advocating for racial equality and justice in Europe and facilitating cooperation among civil society organizations. We have around 150 members across Europe. So for several years now, INA has been advocating and produced different resources to show the importance of improving equality data mechanism in Europe, to make racial discrimination more visible and in order to implement efficient and well-informed corrective measures. We produce evidence via our annual shadow reports, and what we always say is that there is a lack of data, even though there are also other ways that also allow academics, civil society, other actors to collect this data. There is still a huge gap when it comes to equality data disaggregated by race. So we have an idea of what's happening, but we don't have systematic mechanisms that could allow having a better picture and having better policies. So first, just to give a bit more context, also specifically about the European context, or perspective on equality data. What is equality data? So equality data refers to all types of disaggregated data used to assess the comparative situation of a specific group at risk of discrimination. So there are different ways of collecting data, public statistics via census, administrative files, ad hoc surveys, internal monitoring by enterprises or public administration, judicial system data, data from complaints received by equality bodies. And then there are also different categories, the frames that are used to describe the specificities of each group. And there is also a wide diversity of categories in Europe, and it's also quite related to context. And disaggregated data that are broken down, and we need to ensure that it's possible to break them down into smaller specific subgroups with the same identifiable criteria such as sex, nationality, ethnicity, etc. So why do we need data in order to better address racism? So first, to fight against discrimination, we need more evidence to prove this existing discrimination, to prove discrimination in court, to make discrimination practices transparent and visible, and to quantify discrimination. And then another part is more solution-oriented and less proactive, like ensuring equality. So how can we accommodate the needs of equality groups in advance, develop affirmative measures, measure diversity in the workforce, plan policies, and assess their implementation. So how can we do it? And this is the biggest issue in Europe, because there is a whole misunderstanding and misconceptions about what can stakeholders do when it comes to collection of equality data. Actually, despite this conception among state officials or among stakeholders like companies, civil society organizations, there is a misconception that actually data protection legislation prohibits the collection of this kind of sensitive data, revealing racial and ethnic origin or religion. Actually, it's not prohibited to collect this kind of equality data. EU law and all member states' law allow equality data as long as such data are provided voluntarily and according to data protection standards. The EU Data Protection Directive, which is transposed into national law in all EU member states, stipulates exceptions to prohibition of processing sensitive personal data, such as data revealing ethnic or racial origin or religion, when express consent is given, when the state has obligation in the field of employment law, for protection of the rights of others, or for reason of substantial public interest. So these are the four exceptions in order to collect this kind of data. Of course, the interpretation of EU law differs in the legislation of EU member states. For example, to give the example of a former EU member state, the United Kingdom considers the promotion of equality as a justification for equality data collection, therefore adding exceptions to their data protection law. Sweden and France have not yet considered that combating discrimination and promoting equality is a reason of public interest, but it's still possible. So there is a lot of work being done at the EU level to clarify this legislation, to clarify the misconception, to work with member states in order to clear and ensure these mechanisms are put in place. There is also, like at ENA, we have also a specific partnership with companies to work on this issue. In 2009, we have put in place the Equal at Work platform, which is actually a platform of exchange and dialogue with companies to discuss and share best practices on racial diversity, and we see an increasing interest in collecting equality data in their structures. And we also have seen this interest to better understand the legal challenges, because of course there are, as I mentioned, there are also different ways to interpret national law. There may be also additional obstacles. For example, in France and Germany, there is also trade unions' role to actually, there is this phase of consultation of trade unions in order to be able to collect this kind of data in companies. And so we are working with them, and actually we have just set up a working group on that to actually clarify these little specificities in a different national context. But in general, there is nothing that prohibits, according to the law, collecting this kind of equality data. And we already have partners who are already developing in Europe specific equality data mechanism internally, and including categories related to race and ethnicity in their staff surveys. And I just want to highlight the different specific principles to collect equality data that INA has developed in its different publications, in order to respect the law and to respect also the participation of racialized people. So first, self-identification, identification that should be based on the individual data subject perception or their ethnic or racial origin. Voluntary response, that every individual has the right to opt into data collection. Anonymous data collection, that sensitive data must always be treated confidentially. In addition, secure data collection implies that early anonymization must be provided for every piece of information. Informed consent and community consultation throughout the process, and this is also something that is key in our principles, and that we are also advocating towards institutions and companies. The right to choose multiple and intersecting identities, again, this is really key to be able to connect the different inequalities and oppressions. So I think that's more or less it. So we have developed several resources where we go into details on the legal background and the legal approach in the EU. There is also more work that is being done by the EU. For example, the European Commission will organize a high-level roundtable in October with different stakeholders, including companies, to discuss this issue of equality data disaggregated by race, to clarify some misconceptions and to move forward on establishing solid mechanisms. And they will also issue a specific toolkit on equality data collection disaggregated by race, where they will clarify again this. So the European institutions are definitely allies in this, and they are helping also to move forward on this with member states and with other stakeholders. And we are definitely supporting in this endeavor. And as I mentioned, with companies, we are increasingly working on this issue to better understand where are the legal challenges and how we can overcome them.
Lovely, thank you, Julie. It'll be really interesting to see what comes of that, of the event in October, absolutely. And thanks for clearing up some very common misconceptions, as you say. Lovely, thank you to all the speakers there. We're going to have a little panel discussion quickly. Thank you, Kavya and Tejal, for handling the Q&A questions that have come through there. We maybe come back to the last one when we've had a panel. When we've had our panel discussion, to make sure they all get answered. But please, to the audience, please don't feel you've missed your chance. Absolutely, please do send through any more questions you have. Lovely. So the WDI obviously is a big believer in the fact that peer-to-peer learning and peer-to-peer support is really key in this field of corporate reporting and improving equality in the workplace. We've touched on a few good examples from companies, but Kavya, you gave us a few around pay equity, which was great. Tejal, I wonder if I could come to you for a few other ones of good practice to maybe inspire some people and reassure them that good things are happening.
Yeah, it's funny because it's the same one that Kavya actually talked about in Starbucks. Starbucks has really stepped up, I think, when it comes to what they're doing to address civil rights and racial equity related issues. They have issued basically, they've done 3 audits so far. They've been conducted by former Attorney General Eric Holder every time. Most recent one is from 2021. And I really encourage folks, if they're looking kind of for a good example, to take a look at all of the reports really. But in the most recent one, that you'll see that they've got, sections that talk about how they're going to focus on DE&I issues when it comes to career progression, for example, how they're going to start using a more data-driven process when it comes to hiring. How they're tying executive pay to diversity. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they've actually finally kind of disclosed some goals and metrics, so it's a little bit more robust in terms of the disclosure. And it's a really good example, I think, of what we'd like to see kind of as a ideal disclosure. There are other companies that have done this in the finance industry. Bank of America did disclose that they have been doing a pay disparity assessment. It's a third-party pay disparity assessment for a couple of years now, and they actually noted the fact that because of the discrepancies that came out of this assessment, that they were able to kind of true folks up the last couple of years. And so that's a good thing. I think what we're hoping that they'll do is that they'll expand that third-party assessment to other areas kind of their business operations. So.
I'll add one more plug on Starbucks quickly. Of course, there are a number of companies that excel in certain areas, but we also understand that there's a lot of improvement across the board that companies need to address, right? But with Starbucks in particular, I think one key way in which they've shown leadership is they've been very transparent about their process. Some troubles emerged. They were quick to address them in different ways. Some worked, some didn't, and continued to iterate on that and continued to be transparent about their journey in a way that allows other companies to leverage that information and leverage that learning and put into practice some of the principles that Starbucks has adopted through that trial and error process. And I think that that's actually the really remarkable point of it. Having that level of transparency, being transparent even when things are not great, really pushes companies across the board to feel a little bit more comfortable in getting to a place where accountability is the first step and progress is iterative.
Lovely, thank you, Kavya. Julie, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say about no, fab. I do think you're right. I think no one's perfect in this field, and anything anyone can put out there so others can learn from it is really, really important. I think everyone needs to be quite honest about the fact that everyone's learning in this field, and we can make progress best when everyone's being honest about their challenges. Lovely. So Tejal, if I could come to you first with this one, what are we seeing around investors successfully engaging with companies on the issue? What do you see as your role within this field?
Yeah, I think we were fortunate enough in the racial equity audit proposal that we actually did engage with all of the banks that this was filed at. But engagement's a two-way street. And so we can only engage if the banks want to engage with us. And that does not actually always happen. And so in terms of kind of the role for shareholders, I think our role is really to, for lack of a better word, push the envelope a little bit, right? If there is one thing that I think we have realized, at least here in the shareholder space, is that regulatory bodies, they kind of shift in terms of their perspectives, depending on the administration that's in place. And so I know for the last few years, it was increasingly difficult, really to get progress on these sort of areas. and rely on regulatory bodies to really enforce it. And so there was a lot more private ordering, which is basically doing this sort of shareholder process, negotiating with companies and things like that. And so, our role is really to push the envelopes in terms of topics. And if we're lucky enough, we get backup from things like the SEC, which we did this year because the proposal, a couple of the banks actually tried to keep the proposal off the ballot and they were unsuccessful. But that's sort of where I think that our place is. And, the other thing is that because it's not, the metrics aren't based on kind of a regulatory framework, they may not be consistent, and that's okay for something that's very new. We see the racial equity audit as it might not end up looking, these reports may not end up looking like an apples to apples comparison, basically, because each of these banks have different kind of operating processes. They have different lending, facilities and things like that. And we recognize that, but the hope is that eventually, through that iterative process that Kavya is talking about, we could maybe get something that allows for a better comparison.
Fab, thank you. Kavya, I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that. I know you had thoughts when we were talking about this.
Definitely. So I think I completely agree with everything that Tejal says. And Tejal pointed to a great example in her presentation as well around how the New York City comptroller teamed up with several different companies and others to push them to release their EEO1 consolidated reports, which I think was a really phenomenal step. And we've seen a ton of progress, mild, of course, but still progress. But I think one of the key points with that is, and one of the things I appreciated about that entire process was how willing that particular kind of investment community group was interested in engaging on what are the details of the data that matter, how does standardization in reporting matter, and how can we start getting companies to think beyond just the disclosure itself and start scrutinizing what we see in the data. And those sorts of engagements too, and I'd love to see kind of as folks start adopting these disclosures, the engagements that start drilling into the data and not disclosure for disclosure's sake alone will go a very long ways, I think, in actually addressing some of the issues that all of these disclosures kind of raise in the first place. So I know that the investment community, when they partner with data groups and community organizations to understand what the needs are, being able to leverage that information and then push the different companies to release more on those elements has been quite interesting to watch and evolve, and would love to see more of that because I think it's a pretty successful model of engaging the variety of stakeholders who need the data, who are interested in pushing companies to do better and holding them accountable collectively.
Yeah, no, fab. I completely agree. I mean, everyone's interested in this data, right? It's not just the companies themselves and the investors. It's all stakeholders. Everyone wants to see it improve. Lovely, Julie. I wonder if you could give us some thoughts on how all the stakeholders could work together to push these issues forward and improve these issues. As obviously that's your field of expertise.
Yes, definitely. I mean, as the European Network civil society organization, I think we have also a unique place because we have this platform, which is a multi-stakeholder and engaging directly with companies. And in Europe, as we know, until 2020, this issue of racial diversity in the private sector and in the public sector has been very taboo, and the Equalateral platform really allowed for companies to have this privileged space where they can discuss how to improve and to discuss about it. And for us, it was already a great achievement to manage to have partners from the private sector willing to engage with us and discuss this. And we have seen the difference from 2020 and really the increased interest from the private sector to support European civil society organization working on anti-racism. This has been a major development for us. And definitely the fact that there are these different companies working together with us is really increasing their willingness to do better on equality data collection, specifically because this is a sensitive issue in Europe and because it's also can be legally a legal nightmare in some countries, even though, as I said, it's not prohibited. is also like we are really sharing a lot of best practices and how like learning from companies that are trying things, because this is really like at the initial steps in Europe. So we really see the added value of that, and we really see that this space is really helping these partners to move forward in Europe, and also being able to discuss and taking multiple perspective on this issue. And we believe like definitely that the private sector is an actor of change. And I think also in Europe, this was not really the like, even for global companies, sometimes having industries and companies in Europe, it was not always natural for them to also see themselves like that, because of the taboo I mentioned. But we really see the change now, and this platform is helping to move forward a bit quicker.
Lovely, thank you, Julie. I agree. There are kind of traditional taboos to overcome with all this, everything in this field. Lovely. We've just got a couple of minutes left, so the one question has come through the chat for you, Julie, around whether there are any French or German or other European companies that actually report ethnicity data. I'm a bit confused, as you mentioned, this is not prohibited, but needs to be provided voluntarily, like in the US, according to data protection standards. If you could just add a bit more info around that, that would be lovely. I don't know if you can see the question in the chat.
Yes. So it's still it's not prohibited indeed, but as I mentioned, since there are misconceptions even from governments, they have not taken that as an exception that could be used to collect equality data, at least in public, for example, in public censuses or in public data. Then when it comes to companies, it's a bit different, and we see that there are, because of this misconception also led to a lack of data collection in companies, but we see this is really changing, and there is a more understanding of what they can do concretely. But what some companies have shared with them is that there is still a gap a gap of information. And this is why I'm saying that we are always also trying to work with the European institutions to clarify the legal framework to ensure, because especially on the categories, sometimes it's there are some legal different legal approach on which kind of category you can use or not, etc. But definitely, yes, there are companies that are actually collecting, including in their staff survey, ethnicity data. But of course, as I mentioned, respecting some safeguard and having a voluntary approach is one of them. I hope it clarified.
I think that was a lovely answer. Thank you, Julie. And then I realised we're at time, but there was one last question that came through the Q&A function around whether in the UK the ethnicity pay gap is actually beneficial for the Asian community versus other communities. Is that also the case in the US? And Kavya, you have something to say. Lovely, thank you.
I love this question. I think this is a really important question. So what we see with the data is that when we take a look at aggregate Asian American communities in the US too, when taking a look at the Asian American community compared to white communities, compared to all communities, they tend to have higher wages across all points of the distribution. However, this is also a feature of the fact that Asian American is a monolithic category. The reality is that when you begin to disaggregate the Asian American data and take a look at Asian American communities, NHPI communities, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities, and all of the underlying groups within them, you start seeing very different stories about which community you take a look at. And so this is in some ways kind of an issue with categorization of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander groups, because it's such a broad category encompassing so many different ethnic communities that it begins to mask what the actual state of pay equity is on one end of the distribution versus the other. So if you take a look at very specific categories of highly educated Asian American workers, you see that drives a lot of these pay gap kind of benefits. I wouldn't call them benefits necessarily, but certainly higher wages at points of the distribution. But then when you start taking a look at other communities, refugee communities, and smaller kind of ethnic groups, you begin to realize that they're at a very kind of large disadvantage when taking a look at the pay distribution as well.
Lovely, thank you. Very comprehensive answer. Thank you, Kavya. Lovely. I think that's it. Unless anyone has any burning questions, please do feel free to send them through, and we'll email you a response. But just remains to say thank you very, very, very much to all our speakers. As we said, it's obviously a very complex issue, so having such expert brains on the line to discuss it is really, really useful for us. Thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you very much to all the audience. I hope you found it interesting, and we've got lots of other events. The WGI has lots of other events lined up for the rest of the year, so please do feel free to sign up for any of those. But lovely, thank you very, very much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, whichever time zone you're in. Lovely, thank you very much. Bye-bye.